Once I started stacking and combining modulation pedals, it was like a whole new world of options opening up, because I really started to understand why some of my individual modulation effects, even though they were perfectly good quality effects that I was using, why they would so often sound quite cliche and predictable and kind of one-dimensional. Because once you start stacking modulation pedals, in general, the sound becomes less predictable with more of a unique sound and lots of opportunity for getting creative. So in this video, I'll show you some of my favourite combinations, and along the way, I'll just share some of the general rules of thumb that I use that work for me. And hopefully that just saves you a bit of time if you decide that this is something you want to explore for yourself. Let's start off simple. I'll just stack 2 chorus pedals. So I've set this Electro-Harmonic small clone to a fairly slow, subtle chorus. And I've set the Boss CH1 to a slightly faster, more intense chorus sound. And when you're stacking modulation pedals of the same type, like this, contrasting the settings is generally a good approach. It works most of the time, I find. And it gives you 3 very usable settings. It means you've got a subtle chorus, a slightly more obvious chorus, and then the 2 combined give you this rich, complex chorus. And that's really the best way I can think to describe it. It's, you know, lush and complex. Just listen to how plain and kind of one-dimensional the individual chorus pedals can sound on their own once your ear has gotten used to that complex, unpredictable swirl of the 2 chorus pedals combined. Let's do a similar thing with phasers. I've set this Electro-Harmonics Badstone, which is a 6-stage phaser, to a fairly slow and subtle setting. And the Boss PH2 is set to a 10-stage phaser, which I've set a little bit faster. Be careful not to go too crazy with the modulation pedal that you're setting to the more intense settings. You know, don't go too wild with the settings for that, because what can happen is it can just dominate the sound completely and you can't hear the combination of the 2 pedals anymore. You'll just hear that one really intense effect. If I set this PH2 to its 12 stages of phasing, it just dominates the sound too much, I find. So just be aware that can happen sometimes. I really like this sound for kind of funky reggae parts and stuff like that. It's a very similar concept to the multi-stage phaser that Lee Scratch Perry would use in a lot of his recordings. That's the Mu-Tron biphase. When you combine 2 different types of modulation effect, like I'm doing here, I'll combine phaser with flanger, I find there's much less of a need for contrast in the settings anymore. You can actually have the settings more or less the same and just let the contrast in the type of effect be the main feature of the sound. So I've got a slow phaser going into a slow flanger here, and I find it gives a really lovely swoosh sound, and it's very different to the kind of obnoxious and kind of cliche swoosh sound that you can often get from a phaser or a flanger pedal being used on their own. can of course vary the settings on two different modulation effects, but I find I get best results when I don't go too intense with either one of the individual effects. That way it seems to just give the sound a bit of space so that you can hear both effects simultaneously kind of blending together. So I've got a fairly fast but subtle and shallow chorus together with a slow flanger here, and I think it's a nice complex sound. It's quite difficult to pinpoint exactly what's going on with the modulation sound with this, and I think it gives a pretty nice kind of mysterious swirl to the sound. This next one is interesting. This is for a lo-fi, kind of slightly broken chorus vibrato sound. It's going towards the sound of a sort of snarled up tape machine, but it is a chorus sound at the same time. And for this, it's worth knowing what the terms wow and flutter mean. So when you have a tape machine that's seen better days, you get this wow and flutter created in the playback of the tape. The wow is the slow, gradual variation of pitch. It sounds exactly as the word describes it. It's this kind of wow sound. And then there's the flutter, which is the very fast fluttering of the pitch. So here I've got a vibrato pedal doing the slow wow type variation in pitch. Know that it's not essential to have a vibrato pedal doing this. You could do it in different ways. You could use a whammy bar to do it. Another way, if you haven't got a whammy bar, is to just flex the neck a little bit. That can work quite well. And I've got a fast chorus doing the more flutter type sound. I think this is a really nice way of moving away from those more cheesy cliche chorus sounds. You can just fine tune the depth and effects levels for how extreme you want to go with it. Envelope filter into a phaser gives a great funk sound. The envelope filter is probably the main effect you'll hear when you're playing shorter, more dynamic parts, but when you stop and play longer notes, you'll hear the envelope slowly closing and that fast pulsing of the phaser will come to the front of the sound. The higher stage phaser you use, the kind of thinner and funkier the sound will probably be, and it's probably a good idea to use a compressor pedal as well at the end because there's some pretty sharp transients going on with this setup as well. Tremolo seems to blend pretty well with most other modulation effects. I think because there's no variation in tone on a tremolo, you know, the only thing that's modulating is the volume level. The tone stays exactly the same. I think there's a bit more space in the sound to play with. So rhythmic square wave tremolos work pretty well when you combine them with chorus, phaser or flanger, and it gives this nice synth type sound. Stacking multiple tremolo pedals is fun if you want to get some glitchy, choppy rhythms going on. I'm going to stack the TR2 with my amp tremolo here, and know that stacking tremolos like this kind of moves you towards the type of sound you get from the Boss slicer pedals. So if you do like this type of sound, then they're worth checking out as well.